Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Swift foxes and black-footed ferrets coming home to the Great Plains. Presented by Kristy Bly. Kristy is a wildlife conservation biologist and a program manager for the Northern Great Plains program. It is a pleasure to have you with us today, Kristy. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here today on behalf of NatHab and World Wildlife Fund. And today I'm going to share with you some stories about two of my favorite grassland species, black-footed ferrets and swift foxes. They both have a lot in common. They are both small, live on the prairie, use burrows created by burrowing mammals like prairie dogs to seek shelter and raise their young. And they are a very important part of the food chain of the Great Plains of North America, and their presence on the landscape signifies the health of the prairie ecosystem. And I've been lucky enough to work with World Wildlife Fund for about 13 years now. And as mentioned, I am a wildlife conservation biologist and a program manager for our Northern Great Plains program. And today I'll start chatting with you about black-footed ferrets. The black-footed ferret is one of North America's most endangered mammals. They are long, slender animals, which enable them to easily navigate prairie dog burrows. They weigh between 1.5 and 2.5 pounds, and they can grow up to about 24 inches long. They are nocturnal, meaning they're active mostly at night, and a strip of dark fur across their eyes, as you can see here, gives them an appearance of wearing a mask, which is why we call them the masked bandits of the prairie. So historically, the black-footed ferret was found throughout the Great Plains, mountain basins, and semi-arid grasslands of the Great Plains of North America, wherever prairie dogs occurred. And in this case, they overlap the ranges of 3 prairie dog species: blacktails, whitetails, and gunnisons. And this has worked out well for them in terms of they are obligate predators of prairie dogs. But today, unfortunately, while there was once hundreds of thousands of ferrets, we believe, in this ecosystem, there are now only about 300 ferrets located in the areas where you see the stars on your screens. And I'll talk about that, why they declined, in a little bit here. So they evolved with prairie dogs many, many moons ago. They specialize on prairie dogs, meaning they're obligate predators of prairie dogs. They not only eat prairie dogs for food, but use their burrows for shelter and raising young. And this was a good strategy until prairie dog populations started to decline. And in the 1800s and 1900s, prairie dog populations were reduced by 98% of their range. So ferret populations plummeted at the same time. And there are 3 main causes of these declines. First, habitat loss. When European settlement occurred on the prairie in the 1800s and early 1900s, there was a conversion of native prairie to cropland for agriculture and to grow crops for food. This led to loss of prairie dog burrows and subsequently of prairie dogs. In addition, there was a large-scale poisoning program aimed at prairie dogs to create more grass for cattle. And this also led to the decline in prairie dogs, which also led to the decline in ferrets. And finally, a non-native disease called Savatic Plague arrived in North America in the 1900s. It's a bacterium spread by fleas to prairie dogs and ferrets, and both of them are highly susceptible to the disease and die from it. So by the late 60s, it was believed that black-footed ferrets were extinct, and they were listed under the Endangered Species Act at that point in time. Then in 1964, in Millette County, South Dakota, a population of ferrets was discovered, and this population seemed to be somewhat healthy. Right after this population was found, ferrets were listed as endangered, and there was an attempt to trap ferrets from that wild population and bring them into captivity to save the species from extinction. Because remember, we thought this was the last ferret population alive in the wild. So right after they took those ferrets into captivity, the wild population actually perished, and that's likely due to plague or canine distemper. And then, unfortunately, captive breeding efforts were not successful. And by 1979, the last ferret in captivity died as well. So once again, we believed ferrets were extinct. Then, in a stroke of luck, just when we thought biologists were lost forever, or when ferrets were lost forever, a ranch dog named Shep brought a ferret home to its owners. Its owners brought it to a taxidermist who subsequently identified it as a black-footed ferret. And people were pretty excited at this point in time because we now found a population of 129 ferrets in the wild. It was pretty exciting. This population was studied pretty heavily. In 1985, plague and canine distemper started killing prairie dogs in this population and subsequently started killing ferrets. So there was a pretty big effort to live trap ferrets and bring them into captivity to try to save the species once again. So 24 animals were caught, 18 of those survived, and at this time, captive breeding did work. And thankfully, because in 1987, the Wyoming population perished and there were no ferrets left in the wild again. And thankfully, as I mentioned just briefly before, captive breedings were successful, and they were so successful that we were able to breed enough ferrets at zoos and captive breeding facilities throughout the United States and Canada in order to reintroduce ferrets back into the wild. And so by 1991, 10 years after that last population in South Dakota in Wyoming was discovered, we were able to release ferrets into the wild again. And since then, ferrets have been reintroduced into 30 places from Canada to Mexico. So in order to remove the black-footed ferret from the endangered species list, the goal calls for 3,000 breeding adult ferrets, and there needs to be at least 30 individuals in 30 or more populations across their range. Currently, as I mentioned earlier, we only have 300 ferrets in the wild, give or take. And these are found in about 14 locations. So we have a long way to go to fully recover the species and to remove it from the endangered species list. So we achieve recovery in two key ways. First, we monitor populations of both ferrets and their prairie dog prey. And secondly, and most importantly, we address the two main threats to their survival today, which is Savatic Plague, the non-native disease that's spread by fleas, and not enough space for ferrets to live. Ferrets require up to 10,000 acres or more of prairie dog colonies to survive in the wild. So we need more places where ferrets can live. Black-footed ferrets are nocturnal, which means in order to monitor them, we must look for them at night. And we typically do this using handheld spotlights mounted to a vehicle. Sometimes we set up a camera like you see here on a prairie dog burrow where ferrets are to see how many kits they have. And once we find them, we trap them from their burrows in a live trap, and we inoculate them against canine distemper and Savatic Plague. And each ferret is vaccinated once in its lifetime, and those vaccinations are good for life. We also need to vaccinate their prairie dog prey and protect their prairie dog prey from Savatic Plague as well, because without protecting prairie dogs, ferrets would have no food to eat. So we do that by putting a dust insecticide down into prairie dog burrows to reduce populations of fleas that carry plague. We also try to deliver peanut butter flavored vaccine baits, colored in blue here so we can see them, to prairie dogs because it's not really realistic to live trap and vaccinate individual prairie dogs. So we deliver these baits by drone, by UAV. This is a triple shooting machine that delivers 3 baits at a time from the air. And we also deliver it from all-terrain vehicles. As you can see on the left side of this ATV, there is a triple shooting machine in which we deliver baits from there. It shoots 1 bait down at a time. down to the middle and 2 baits out to the side. And if you can look on your left, the bottom left part of your screen here, once these baits are delivered, prairie dogs come above ground and they consume them and are subsequently protected from plague. And the goal is to have enough prairie dogs eating enough baits to create herd immunity. I'm going to play a video that kind of captures some of what I talked about here, but really saving an endangered species from extinction, like black-footed ferrets, requires perseverance, innovation, and partnerships. And thanks to a dog named Shep, captive breeding efforts, reintroductions, and mitigation of Savatic Plague, we are helping to recover the masked bandit of the prairie. So I hope you enjoy this video.
Black-footed ferrets are thought to be extinct, 2 different kinds, and I've been on the Endangered Species Act for a long time, and a lot of people are working to recover. Ferrets are an obligate predator of prairie dogs. That's the only place they can live and survive is on prairie dog colonies. Probably one of the biggest obstacles to ferret recovery is plague because it's highly lethal to both prairie dogs and ferrets, and it can wipe out thousands of acres of prairie dogs in just a few weeks.
If we don't protect their prey-based prairie dogs, they would have nothing to eat anyway. So it's important for us to find a way to manage plague in prairie dogs as well as ferrets. So we developed the vaccine first, and then we started looking for baits that we could deliver to prairie dogs. And we put peanut butter into it as an attractant for prairie dogs, as well as mix the vaccine right in.
It takes maybe more than 10,000 acres of prairie dogs to support what might be a viable ferret population.
And the objectives under World Wildlife Fund and all the partners that we work with is to remove the black-footed ferret from the endangered species list.
But if we're going to start treating thousands of acres, we have to find a distribution system. And our best idea so far is a unit that will distribute through ATVs, sort of a hopper that will drop one pellet straight down and then shoot one to the left, shoot one to the right 30 feet simultaneously. And I've been able to treat about 50 acres per hour on an ATV. And then the other idea came up with using unmanned aerial systems.
There's a lot of places I imagine that are going to be not ATV accessible. That service for the guy is really going to show its true worth. So we load the correct amount of pellets. We'll put the hopper on. We go ahead and click in the con, it's loaded, and then it takes off and does its mission. We're about 60 feet up, flying at about 20 miles per hour. So you can watch it go down a transect line on the computer, so we get to see exactly what's going on. So every 1 second, it will drop a pellet.
So they eat the baits, and that immunizes them against the disease. This project has involved so many collaborators, molecular biologists that created the vaccine in the first place, and all the field partners that have helped us. I think it's something like 30 different agencies involved in this project. We've talked a long time about how we would deliver millions of baits to prairie dogs. And so it's been great to see these people get together and really figure out how we could do it.
This project fits well with the mission of World Wildlife Fund to use the best available science to achieve our conservation objectives and to bring back the endangered black-footed ferret.
Woohoo! It's also just a lot of fun. Saving endangered species from extinction. Oops, pardon me. It's not an easy feat, but it's one worth doing. So now I'd like to transition to talk with you today about my favorite fox, the swift fox. Their story is similar to black-footed ferrets in that they almost disappeared from the prairie, but thanks to concerted efforts by many people in many places, they too are making a comeback. I like to think of swift foxes as charismatic predators of the prairie. You can see how cute they are. And they are the smallest native canid of North America. They weigh 5 pounds soaking wet. So they're smaller than most house cats, far smaller than a coyote, and far smaller than a red fox, if you are familiar with those two species. They are obligates of grasslands, meaning that they really prefer wide open spaces of short to mixed grass prairie where they can see above the grass to detect oncoming predators of theirs like coyotes or owls or eagles. They also are den dependent. You can see this fox here is standing on an old prairie dog burrow. They depend on a series of burrows for shelter and raising young. And if you've been to the prairie, you'll know there aren't very many trees on the landscape. And most of the places that animals find shelter are below ground. So prairie dog burrows and other burrows dug by animals like badgers are really important for the survival of this species. And they tend to use different dens throughout the year, so they have more places to escape to. And if one den becomes laden with fleas or ticks, they can move to another pretty readily. So one of the coolest things about swift foxes is that they're swift. They're very, very fast. They can run up to 40 miles an hour. And this is important for them because they need to avoid coyotes. Coyotes tend to compete with them for the same kind of foods. So coyotes kill foxes, but swift foxes also need to be fast in order to catch their prey. And their diet consists of rabbits, ground squirrels, prairie dogs, other small mammals like mice, insects, and also things like roadkill animals, and sometimes berries. So they eat a pretty diverse diet, which helps keep them healthy. This is a mom that we were able to get a photograph of in northern Montana, and she was a very prolific predator of ground squirrels. So swift foxes, like ferrets, were once abundant in much of the same area ferrets and prairie dogs were through the shortgrass and mixed grass prairies of North American Great Plains, from Canada to Texas, from the Rocky Mountain front to the Missouri River. But in the late 1800s and early 1900s, just like ferrets and prairie dogs, their distribution and numbers declined by 90%. And this was caused mainly due to poisoning that was intended for coyotes and wolves, and also due to the plow up of the prairie to plant crops. So we actually thought that foxes were gone from Canada and Montana, North Dakota, and this whole northern half of the range. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but they pretty much were gone from this whole northern half. Populations persisted in this lower portion of the range in the south, and started to recover from the south into the central portion of the range. But for many, many years, swift foxes were absent from this entire northern portion of their range. And there were so few foxes left that by the early 1990s, there was a petition to list swift foxes as endangered on the endangered species list. There was a swift fox conservation team formed to prevent the listing and to help recover the swift foxes. And they established a goal of increasing suitable and available habitat where foxes live to 50%. So if we go back to this slide here, they want to make sure, the goal is to make sure that foxes live in at least 50% of the available habitat that is in their historical range. Today, they occupy only about 40% of that suitable habitat. And because of that, they are considered a threatened species in Canada. They are state threatened in South Dakota, and are a species of greatest conservation need in Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming. So in order to reach the goal of 50% abundance and distribution in their range, reintroductions of swift foxes into the wild are helping to improve their status. And there have been many, many efforts since the 1980s that have led to the establishment of a new population in the northern portion of their range. And that's thanks in part to this huge effort by the Canadians. They reintroduced almost 1,000 swift foxes into the wild over this a period of 14-ish years between 1983 and 1997. And that did help return foxes to the northern portion of their range. And that population did start to expand into Montana, and with help from introductions on tribal lands in Montana from Blackfeet and the Fort Peck Reservation in Montana, there were some pretty good successful efforts to get foxes back. And the Canadian effort really inspired these 6 other reintroductions to happen in Montana and in South Dakota. So this is what I'm kind of talking about. Their current range looks a lot patchier than we once believed, but we think this is the best estimate of where foxes are today. So this big blob to the north between Montana and Canada is where the Canadians started reintroduction efforts and has helped to return foxes to this portion of their range. So there's still a gap here in Montana. It's a distribution gap of about 200 miles. And in order for us to ensure connectivity between this population to the north and the core population to the south, and to enable foxes to be less susceptible to catastrophic events and disease and drought, other natural disasters, we want to make sure we're connecting these populations. And so one way we're doing that is through another reintroduction effort, primarily on the Fort Belknap Reservation. It's actually located in this gap area here, and Fort Belknap the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation is in north central Montana. It's home to the Nakota and Aninin tribes. Swift foxes have been absent here for over 50 years. And hadn't really made their way back because of this river here, the Milk River. It's not impassable, but swift foxes tend to avoid waterways where they might be susceptible to predation. So in any case, we conducted a thorough assessment with many partners to evaluate suitable and available habitat, as well as prey availability for swift foxes at Fort Belknap, and determined it was a really good fit to reintroduce swift foxes here. So excitingly, we live trapped 27 swift foxes from a healthy population in Wyoming. And foxes are actually fairly easy to catch. They live on shortgrass prairie, and if you place a trap along a fence line and hang some chicken or some sardines in the back of the trap, you'll often catch foxes. So we were able to trap 27 this year, and we transported them back to Montana, where we held them in these soft release acclimation pens for 3 to 5 days. And the purpose of these soft release pens is to get the animals used to their new landscape and try to hold them to an area longer than they might otherwise be. We've learned over the years that if you hard release a swift fox, swift foxes into an area, they might spread farther away than they would if they are acclimated to a site for a handful of days. So this has been a great technique to help swift foxes stay where we'd like them to establish. And in the meantime, we fed them food and water. So some of them were pretty happy to do that. And we tried really hard to release them in the same arrangement in which we live trap them. And in some cases, we were able to trap them as family members, which is also really helpful. So once the acclimation period was over, we were able to open up the cages and let them go, which is always a nerve-wracking but simultaneously exciting event. And each fox is fitted with a GPS satellite collar prior to release, so we can monitor their movements post-release. We will also be monitoring them by setting up camera traps, which will become really important in the springtime to document number of pups born in each litter. And reproduction is a really great metric for success in a new population that's been established. If you have animals pairing up and breeding and raising pups in an area, there's a great probability that they'll stick around for a while. And so we're hoping that by additional translocations of foxes from Wyoming and Colorado in the next couple of years, plus reproduction, that we will achieve our goal of establishing a self-sustaining population of swift foxes at Fort Belknap, which will then hopefully connect that northern population with the core population to the south. So I am now going to share with you some fun footage from the reintroduction that talks about the process that I just shared with you. So bear with me while I pull this video up. open this up. This is the habitat in which we live trapped swift foxes from. They are a little nervous when you first catch them, understandably. They also received health checks by a veterinarian before we moved them to Montana to make sure they were free of disease and were healthy enough to move. So this is us driving from Wyoming to Montana with the foxes. And these are two siblings, pretty psyched to have fresh food, but also a little bit nervous about being in the soft release pen, which is normal. They do get used to it after a couple of days, as you'll see in this next couple of video segments. So here is a family that we caught. One of their notorious identifications is their black tipped tail and their black muzzle patches. And we located these soft release pens over prairie dog burrows so they could go down below ground. And we also provided berry kennels above ground for shelter and protection from sun and wind, etc. And that's what they look like at a distance. And then when we were ready to release them, we just pulled open one side of the mesh panel. As you see here, this fox is pretty excited to be released. And this is the time of the year, in the fall of every year, when young pups born in the spring are ready to disperse away from their family. So this is why we tend to reintroduce foxes to new areas in the fall, because it's when young juveniles are ready to move away from their family groups anyway. And then we slowly take the rest of the pen down, but we leave food and water out for a handful of days too. And this definitely helps with a transition from their original home site to their new home site. And this one you can see is pretty psyched to have a free meal and is taking it with them, him or her. This time of the year, they really blend into the prairie when the grass dries out like this. And so far, we have locations on 8 of the 27 animals. One was killed by vehicles, which is another main source of mortality for them, coyotes being one. Killed by cars is another. But we've only lost one that we know of to a vehicle. We've had one disperse about 50 miles away to the north and west. Look how fast they are. So cool. And the rest that we know of are hanging around, which is super exciting. And we will keep tracking them and hope for their continued success and survival. So I wanted to just end briefly with talking about why saving Blackwood ferrets and swift foxes is important. You know, why should we care about these two prairie animals? And there are many reasons to talk about, really, but they are two of the many wildlife species whose populations are in trouble. Worldwide, the population sizes of mammals and birds and fishes and reptiles and amphibians have seen an alarming average drop of 68% since 1970 in my lifetime. In the 48 years I've been alive, we've seen just a tremendous loss of wildlife and biodiversity loss on Earth. And that's because humans have a large footprint on the planet. And we also had a big impact on the presence of these species. We caused their original decline. And so I feel like we have an obligation to help restore them to areas where habitat remains suitable. And while a lot of the Great Plains is not suitable anymore, there are amazing patches of connected habitat that are. And so bringing them back not only helps to restore their presence on the landscape, but the role that they play in the food chain as well. And all of the species on Earth deserve to have a place here, and they need our help more than ever to ensure that they persist for many years to come. So the 3 things that I recommend you do to help ensure the persistence of endangered and threatened species on Earth is first to learn about endangered, threatened, and imperiled species in your own backyard. What species exist in your state that are in trouble? Learn about them and see what you can do to then be a champion for them. Share what you know, share what you've learned with your friends, with your families, with your teachers, to help advocate for their presence. And finally, donate your time in helping to restore their habitat and helping to restore them and helping to monitor them. Or if you are so inclined and are able to, you can also donate money in order to help them thrive and help conservation organizations, government entities, states, zoos, universities help to ensure that there's a lasting legacy of prairie wildlife and other wildlife species here on Earth. So with that, I really thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Kristy. For those watching, I'd just like to remind you, if you have a question for Kristy, you can submit your questions in the control panel under that questions field. All right, we will do some questions about ferrets first. Actually, the first 2 questions are kind of about both. Are these 2 species being included in the rewilding efforts of the native prairie?
I'm not sure which exactly rewilding effort you are speaking to, but there are many conservation efforts that are working, conservation organizations, tribes, state, federal governments, and private individuals that are working to restore populations of both species across the Great Plains. So in almost every state that ferrets and foxes live, there are specific efforts to either bring them back, monitor their populations, and also protect them from threats.
Okay, great. And there was a question about how long foxes and ferrets each live if they don't get ill. What's the average lifespan?
That's a great question. Well, I think, average 3 to 5 years for actually both species. There are exceptions to that where, you can find older foxes that are 8 years old. We actually had live trapped a swift fox many, many years ago who was 8 years old, and we called her Granny. She didn't have very many teeth. We let her stay where she was because she was doing very well. But 3 to 5 years is more common. And of course, in captivity, they live a lot longer as well.
Okay. And there was a lot of concern about the vaccine pellets and whether prairie dogs might eat too many of them and if that causes any side effects.
There are always, that's such a great question. There are always prairie dogs who eat more than their fair share. Peanut butter is a favorite food of prairie dogs, as we've learned in trials in the lab and in more captive settings. So they do. There will be some prairie dogs who eat like 10 of them and others that don't eat any. Thankfully, the vaccine is safe and does not harm those greedy prairie dogs that eat more. It is unfortunate for the ones that don't eat them, but we do hope that enough prairie dogs eat enough vaccine that keeps them protected as a group, that herd immunity. And if plague were to come through, that enough of them are protected that the majority of them would survive.
Okay, is poisoning of either prairie dogs or ferrets now illegal in the states where they live?
Great question. Not usually. Where we are reintroducing ferrets, there have been very diligent efforts to create areas of protection. So, for example, at the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation, there's a conservation area called the Snake Butte Reintroduction Site, and that is home to both ferrets and bison and probably swift foxes now. And there are no poisoning of prairie dogs and shooting of prairie dogs or any wildlife in that area is not allowed except for the removal of bison for food. And so in most cases, that's common. We really try to protect prairie dogs and ferrets where they live. For swift foxes, there are some live trapping seasons or fur trapping seasons on them in parts of their range, more typically to the south where their numbers are more abundant. So not all swift foxes are protected. They are protected in Canada fully.
Okay. And do the ferrets and foxes compete for the same food? Do they eat anything besides prairie dogs?
That is a great question. Yes, they do compete. And in fact, swift foxes will kill black-footed ferrets, which we try to avoid. But you know, it's nature's way, so you can't always control that. You can hope it doesn't happen, but we know that swift foxes and ferrets both eat prairie dogs. Ferrets are pretty predominant predators of prairie dogs. So like 90 or 95% of their diet is made up of prairie dogs. And they will also eat a mouse or something here and there too, or a ground squirrel. And same with swift foxes. So there is definitely a lot of dietary overlap between the two species. And I think that's why we sometimes see where they overlap, foxes kill ferrets.
Okay, and back to the pellets we were just talking about. Do the ferrets eat the pellets?
We don't think so. We haven't documented that they do. So we tend to drop pellets very early in the morning. So just as the sun is coming up, and we try to complete dropping them by noon. So that gives time for prairie dogs who are active during the day to eat most of them while they're awake, so that there's fewer of them in the nighttime when ferrets come out, and also when mice come out. So mice will end up eating them too. And we want prairie dogs to eat the majority of them. So we think that by dropping them early in the morning, prairie dogs have enough time to find most of them. And then hopefully some of the leftovers are eaten by mice before ferrets wake up. But yeah, that's a great question.
And related to that, is there any way, markings or otherwise, to show that an animal was vaccinated, or is that even a concern of yours?
That is a great question. Yes, I could have added this in here. All black-footed ferrets that are released into the wild from captivity go through a boot camp program to kill prairie dogs, to learn how to kill prairie dogs before they're released. And they are also, they also have a microchip, much like we chip dogs between their shoulder blades. So that microchip allows us to track and identify individual ferrets. So when we spotlight them and follow them to a burrow, we have what's called a ring reader, and it goes right over the top of the opening of the prairie dog burrow, and the ferret comes back up through, and that reads their chip. And if we have ferrets that are born into the wild that don't have a chip, they will come back up through that reader and nothing will be read. And so we know that we then need to live trap that animal and vaccinate them against canine distemper and plague, and also give them a microchip so that we know who they are in following years. So the goal every year, we spend a lot of time trying to trap all the kits, is what we call young of the year ferrets, born into the wild every year, to vaccinate them against canine distemper and plague and chip them so we know who they are in subsequent efforts.
That's so cool. How are the black-footed ferrets related to the ferrets people own as pets?
Great question. They are mustelid family, but black-footed ferrets are the only species native to North America, and domestic ferrets that people raise as pets come from either European polecats or Siberian polecats who have been domesticated over time. So they are different species, even though they look a lot alike.
And back to vaccination, sort of on that subject. If a female prairie dog eats the bait before her pups are born, are the pups protected as well?
That's a really great question. The sad answer is no. So we tend to vaccinate, well, it depends on where you are. In the South, you can sometimes vaccinate earlier in the season because the snow dries up quicker than it does in the northern portion. Like in Montana, we often wait till the snow is done and the spring rains are done because it's really hard to get out into the field when everything's really muddy. So we tend to vaccinate in the heart of summer. So let's say July, August, September. Pups are born in the spring, and so they will come above ground and hopefully eat baits as well. So we wait to put out baits until they're old enough to come above ground too. So we get that whole cohort of both adults and prairie dog pups. And then we have to do that again every year to make sure that new animals born into the system are also vaccinated. So it's an annual effort.
It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work.
Okay, we're going to move on to foxes now. Do the swift foxes have many predators?
They don't have a ton, but the ones that they have are significant. So coyotes are a main predator of foxes. And I like to share how the closer a canid is in size to each other, the more they compete for resources. So if you go to Yellowstone National Park, you'll often hear stories, or maybe you're even able to witness wolves killing coyotes, because wolves and coyotes are similar size. And so they compete for similar resources, deer, elk, and then coyotes will kill foxes because they too are similar in size. So the biggest predator of swift foxes are coyotes, is a coyote. And we've actually witnessed great horned owls sometimes killing swift foxes. They pick them up out of the sky. Once they come down and land and pick them up, and golden eagles will kill swift foxes too. But I think of all of those, coyotes and vehicles humans drive are the two biggest mortality threats to swift fox.
What's prevented the listing of swift foxes on the Endangered Species Act?
Wow, excellent question. It's actually been the formation of a swift fox conservation team who is made up of many state and federal and tribal individuals, nonprofit organizations, universities, zoos, individuals interested in swift fox recovery, retired folks from who've worked to recover swift foxes for many, many years. And it's this collective effort followed by the 7 reintroductions I shared earlier that has really prevented the listing. At the time of the proposed listing, there were enough foxes in the southern portion of their range that the Fish and Wildlife Service determined the listing request was unwarranted. But subsequent to that, the Swift Fox Conservation Team really rallied to help bring foxes back to that northern portion of their range, and that has kept foxes from becoming endangered. So people make the world go round, and in this case, teamwork makes the dream work, and the dream is to keep foxes on the landscape, and it's been working.
Nice, that's great. Are the foxes susceptible to canine distemper or any other diseases, and do you also have to vaccinate them?
Great question. They are less susceptible to Savatic plague. They can carry titers for plague, and that's something that we're always cautious of if we are moving foxes from a place of known plague to an area of less plague or inactive plague. Now plague is pretty much presumed to be across the Great Plains, but we know that plague doesn't kill foxes. Canine distemper probably does. We don't vaccinate foxes against either disease. Really kind of the bigger issue is our ectoparasites like fleas and ticks that tend to overcome them at some point in time. But yeah, those are great questions. We could consider vaccinating against canine distemper in foxes, but so far we just haven't needed to.
And are the swift foxes related to dogs at all?
They are in the canid family. I have a dog that looks a lot like a swift fox, but she weighs like 35 pounds more. So yeah, they are. It's interesting. Swift foxes are as dainty as cats, but they are in the dog family, the canid family. So they are related at that family level. Obviously, they're different species than domestic dogs, but they have a lot of similar characteristics in that they often live in family groups, they mate for life, they're very social among their kin and are protective of their own, much like dogs are.
And there was a lot of curiosity about the collars. How long do they work for? How far can it transmit? And is there a risk of getting them hung up on fences?
All great questions. So collars are the bane of most biologists' existence because they are just amazing in the information that they can provide us in terms of trying to find animals that we wouldn't be able to find otherwise. So by tracking individuals, we can see, for example, we had a swift fox that we released in South Dakota back in the early 2000s, and it went over 300 miles into North Dakota. And we knew that because it had a collar on. If we didn't have that collar on, we wouldn't have had that information that this animal after release moved 300 miles away. They have greatly increased their ability to, like now these are GPS collars, so you can get satellite that basically transmits to satellites, and the particular collars that the Fort Belknap foxes are wearing, that information stored in the collar is downloaded when they hit a cell signal. So if they go into cell range, the information is downloaded and we can see exactly where they've been or whether there's a mortality. They don't always all work. So of the 27 foxes that were collared, only 8 have come online. Part of the challenge is that swift foxes spend a lot of time underground, and so they have to come above ground to be able to transmit, and in this case they need to be in cell range too, which adds another level of challenges in remote habitat that isn't always great in cell service. Related to collar injuries or issues, one of the biggest issues we have are collars being chewed off by other foxes. We had a couple of those happen already, where a sibling or a parent helped free the other of its collar. So that's actually kind of funny. We haven't documented any collars being hung up, any foxes being hung up from their collars anywhere. That doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but we try really hard to appropriately fit collars and avoid collaring juveniles that are too little, that aren't full-sized yet, because if you put it on too tight, that can cause problems. If you put it on too loose, they can lose it. So there's definitely a rule of thumb around tightness, and most of the collaring efforts are supervised by veterinarians, so that's helpful too.
Great.
In the old days, yeah, sorry, I'll just follow up. In the old days, back in the early 2000s, 20 years ago, we were following foxes in the old school style where they were not GPS collars, but they would just transmit a signal and you'd have to go around with a Yagi and look for them. And we actually conducted flights where we would put an antenna on the bottom of a plane and fly an area to pick up fox locations. And we also had a truck mounted antenna that we would drive around and try to find them. And once foxes locate in an area, they tend to stay. So it's always those animals that den up and stay and reproduce that we're trying to track. But those guys that take off and disperse into the ether are much harder to keep track of.
That's incredible. So there were a few people who wanted to know why the foxes skip.
Oh, that's a great question. I think it's just who they are. We skip, right? It's just another form of movement. Maybe there's some energy savings there. Maybe it's that in-between gait from walking and trotting to like full-on running. Because if you think about it, they can really get a lot of, they can cover a lot of terrain by jumping up in the air like that. The other thing I think is sometimes that the grass that they live in can be hard for them to see. Like if the grass height itself is taller than their vision, then the skipping helps them kind of see up and above where they're going to keep track of, you know, oncoming predators like coyotes, or to keep tracking their prey. That's a fun question.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a few more questions for you today, and these are going to be either about both species or just general questions. So what differences do you see in the prairie when there are no ferrets or swift foxes?
Oh, that's a great question. You know, it's really the difference of no prairie dogs that is the most noticeable. So if any of you have been on a prairie dog town during the day, you'll know it's really loud. There is all sorts of chatter happening. Prairie dogs alarming, prairie dogs giving the all clear sign because everything's cool and fun. There are birds chirping, there are crickets talking, and so it's definitely like lively on a prairie dog colony during the day for sure. And if plague comes out and kills the majority of the prairie dogs, it's like a ghost town. You'll go out into that same prairie dog colony that was once like thriving, and it is dead silent. So that is the most noticeable thing. The other noticeable thing is when we are out spotlighting at a location for ferrets. When ferrets aren't there, it makes for a very long night. You are just looking for that notorious emerald green eye shine all night long. And when you don't see them, it breaks your heart. There are many reasons foxes and Blackwood ferrets hide at night away from the vehicle, but in areas where they're doing well, you're going to see them. So it's really heartbreaking when you're driving around and they're not there. And then, you know, you're always asking yourself, well, why? Why aren't they here? And what are we doing wrong? Or what could we be doing differently in order to help them be happier here or thrive here? Is there just not enough food? Are they getting shot? Are they, you know, moving out of this area and we just can't find them? So definitely reasons there. With swift fox, it's pretty hard to see a swift fox on any given day. They are mostly nocturnal, but they're also somewhat crepuscular, meaning they'll be active early in the morning, right after the sun comes up, and they'll be active right before the sun goes down. And those are great times to looking for dens with young on them. I love looking for swift fox parents and pups, because once you find a den, you can, you know, set up on a faraway place and watch them. It's just so fun. But it's not something you see every day. So their absence is a lot less noticeable on the landscape. But it sure makes a difference when they're there. You just know they're out there, and that's good enough for me.
On the subject of food, how much and how often do ferrets and foxes need to eat? Say, how many prairie dogs would they eat in a day?
That's such a fun question. So a ferret needs to kill a prairie dog every 1 to 3 days. there have been estimates of one ferret will kill up to 273 prairie dogs a year. So their nutritional requirements are big, especially for new moms, you know, raising kits. So she's hunting a lot because she has to feed her babies. So, and I failed to say this earlier, but ferrets will have anywhere from 3 to 5 kits. So that's a lot of food. She's got to hunt a lot in order to feed her family. So in July, August, and September, those are really big months where female ferrets are working pretty hard to kill prairie dogs, who are not easy to kill, especially if you haven't gotten good at it yet. We catch a lot of ferret kits who have kind of like bite marks on their face from not getting a good bite on a prairie dog to begin with. Foxes, I'd say the same. We watched a den of swift foxes. Actually, one of the pictures I showed you of this mom, she was an avid killer of ground squirrels and prairie dogs. She was just really, really good at it, but she had six pups to feed, and that is so much work. But she was good at it, and she killed every day to feed those animals. So
Wow.
it depends on the year, you know, time of the year and the nutritional requirements of the individuals, if they're raising pups or not.
Okay. And last question I'll take today is, are you optimistic about the future strength of the swift fox and black-footed ferret populations?
Heck yeah. I mean, you have to be right. Like this job is not for the faint of heart. You have to have hope. You have to believe there is place and space for these animals. And I spend my waking moments thinking about how to do my job better, how to make sure we're creating populations that have the best chance of survival, who have the best chance of living for generations to come. And, you know, really, when I was in school and learning about conservation biology and learning how to reintroduce animals into the wild and learning about these individual species, that all really matters. The biology really matters. You have to get that right. You know, and Savatic Plague has been a huge Achilles heel in terms of trying to figure out how to keep these animals alive, at least from the ferret and prairie dog side of things. But the bigger part, or an equally important part, is working with communities living on the landscape. Conservation has to go hand in hand with the communities that are living in the same places these ferrets and foxes and prairie dogs are. Without that, we cannot be successful. And kind of the third leg of that stool, biology, social, is the third is financial. Like, we've got to have the funding to be able to continue maintaining these populations until we can learn how to abate the non-native disease threats that are there, and to have enough space and enough animals in enough places that they can withstand some localized losses and still persist for many generations to come. So I hope every day, and I fight every day, and I hope you guys will join me in doing the same, because we need hope and we need people dedicated to the cause in order to ensure that these animals live for many, many years.
Beautiful. Well said. I think that's a great closing comment from you. So we will end it there. Thank you so much for joining us today. As one person just said, your optimism is infectious. So I really appreciate you taking the time to present for us.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thanks to each and every one of you who have stayed on this long listening. And please feel free to reach out if you ever want to join us in the field and help us out. We always need many hands. Take good care, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kristy. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.